another project. I also want to start by thanking my good friend Sean Joy, who originally reached out to me during the COVID lockdown back in 2020 and said, hey, let's put a project together that's looking at hurricane impacts on both submerged pre-contact, and you do all the shipwreck stuff. And I was like, awesome, let's do it. So here we are all these years later, and I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Sean putting this idea in my brain to begin with. So with that said, a bit of a disclosure. So the original funding for this comes from the National Park Service, which is a sister agency of my bureau. It is administered by the state of Florida Division of Historical Resources, and the grantee is actually another nonprofit named Arc Co-op, and I'm a sub to them. So there are several degrees of separation between me and the Park Service money. So again, interest in full disclosure, I am a federal employee in my day job. I did run this through the department's ethics officer to make sure that I could participate. She gave me the thumbs up. So all of this work was done in my personal capacity. All of my time is donated to this project, so I was not compensated for it. This is all the funding went towards field work and rental. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it because I have a whole lot to cover tonight. So first of all, with Hurricane Michael striking the area off of Mexico Beach, what I wanted to take a look at was up to 8 different sites that were recorded in the Florida Master Site File based on their distance from how close they were to Michael all the way around to sites that were farther away, and just sort of do a comparison. So I selected 3 different areas, as you can see in the yellow circles there in the yellow oval. So an area around St. Joseph Bay, I picked 3 sites over there, off Dog Island and Lanark Reef, and then the last site is over by the mouth of the St. Marks River over near the lighthouse. So as you can kind of see, you have the path of Hurricane Michael up there to the upper left. When Marie catches up,
it's not working.
You're paused. Okay, so when the slide pops up, you will see.
I don't understand why it's not working.
It's
Might need Chris again.
Okay, so anyway, so I selected the site that's closest to the path of Hurricane Michael is Weimar. Almost there. There we go. And the other sites kind of are at increments away from that, but Weimar was by far the closest to Hurricane Michael. So as I talk about these different sites, I'm starting with the sites that are closest to Michael and then moving farther and farther away. So as we go through, data collection involved 2 different phases of field work. There was the remote sensing phase using small boats to collect side scan sonar and multi-beam echo sounder data. And basically what that is towing a towfish in the water that emits sound out, bounces it off the seafloor, and creates a digital rendering of what the seafloor looks like. So that helps me see what's going on around the sites. There was also diver investigations, which is getting in and actually mapping, doing photography and videography of all of the sites to try and record what their current state of preservation looks like. I also did a pretty robust historical and archival research component. And this was hitting all kinds of different information, obviously starting with the master site file, but looking at previous archaeological investigations, previous historical research, hitting all kinds of different archives from the National Archives, Coast Guard, Navy, newspaper archives, photographic collections, historic maps and nautical charts, aerial imagery, all kinds of cool stuff. Even personal accounts and local informants were very, very, very useful. And I was even able to track down a few lighthouse keeper logbooks to give some information, and then ship registries and inspection reports. So this is not all of the data I looked at. This is just sort of some of the major sources of information that I looked at. So we will start with Weimar. This is the one closest to Michael. Weimar is in about 25 feet of water, just about 3.5 miles offshore of Mexico Beach. And you can see it in the black arrow, the black circle. She is located just outside the shipping channel leading into Port St. Joseph. She is currently listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Back in 2006, she was nominated. She's also a Florida Underwater Archaeological Preserve, so a lot of divers are welcome to go out there. She's a steel-hulled vessel that was originally constructed in England in 1919. She was originally named Kilmarnock for service in the British Royal Navy, where she served as a patrol gunboat. After that, she kind of changed hands several times. Interestingly, she was sold in 1928 to U.S. Navy Admiral Richard Byrd for service in Antarctica. She was the first metal hulled vessel to actually go to Antarctica. So she has sort of that interesting backstory. She was renamed Eleanor Bowling by Admiral Byrd after his mom. How sweet. What a good son. Then in 1933, she was sold to the Weimar Shipping Company, who renamed her as Weimar. And at that point, she was now under Panamanian registry and was used as a tramp freighter. On March 21st of 1942, she departed Port St. Joe with a huge load of lumber heading for Cuba when she unfortunately sank. So, because she was a hazard to navigation, the Corps of Engineers ended up dynamiting her. And so this is what she looked like when the Bureau of Archaeological Research investigated her in 2003. So this was to help prepare the information for her National Register nomination and nomination as an underwater preserve. So you can kind of see the bow is to the right of the screen, the stern is to the left, and she's just kind of a jumbled mess of all kinds of stuff. But the red oval indicates an area that I want you to pay attention to, because you can see there's a lot of sand cover over the wreck back then, but after Michael, quite a bit of that was exposed. So basically, she's only about 6 miles away from the eye wall. And when Michael rolled through, the surge on the bottom was like a plow just driving segments off.
Yeah,
But it's fine. Rudy's just trying to help here.
He's projecting it above the screen.
So,
But to get rid of the pass thing, the zoom thing.
so anyway, so the storm rolls in and a lot more of this vessel was exposed because of that. So you can see a lot more of the framing elements there. So this is in July of 2024, even several years after Michael, that exposure has persisted. So we're moving on to the next site, which is a little bit farther away. And this is the former mail steamer SS Florida. Now this wreck is in only about 3 to 4 feet of water, so it's very, very shallow. And it is right near shore on the bay side of St. Joseph Peninsula. Anybody ever been to the T.H. Stone Memorial Park?
Mhm.
So this is where she's located. And Stone's name is going to come back up in a minute, so stay tuned. So she was originally constructed in 1851 in New York. She is a composite built sidewheel steamer, which means she was constructed of both wood and metal. Her remains are currently completely buried, and she measures just under 140 feet in length and just a little less than 30 feet in width. She was built originally to transport mail and passengers and cargo between various ports along the Atlantic seaboard. She was eventually sold to a company in the Gulf, where she began running her service between New Orleans all the way down to Key West and just hitting all the different ports in between. She left Pensacola on August 28th, 1856. So she's the earliest wreck that I looked at. Right when she got near Cape San Blas, they're getting really heavy seas. And so the captain decided to come swing right back around and go into St. Joseph Bay, thinking it's protected water and they'll just wait it out. Well, 2 days later, a hurricane rolls through and it demolished the wreck. Fortunately, everyone survived. And the survivor accounts are pretty incredible, talking about hour by hour, just this vessel just breaking apart and the absolute terror that it must have been. So this is what the site looks like today. It's pretty remote. You can get to it from shore, but you've got to walk a long ways into the park to get up there. You can kayak to it. It's about 7 miles round trip. I can tell you that from personal experience. But you can also get to it from small boats coming over from Port St. Joe, but it is very shallow. So back in 2000 and 2001, the University of West Florida investigated the site, and my friend Jeff Motes did his master's thesis on it. And so this was the site plan that they created back then. They did some excavation to expose some of that wooden hull and see how much was left, and it turns out quite a bit. This particular feature right here in the center, this is the firebox. So this was associated with the steam machine. And that's what sticks up out of the water. So on the upper left, that's what the firebox looked like in 2000. And on the lower right, that's what it looks like now in 2024. So you can see there's been quite a bit of deterioration over time, vertically. So now we're going to move to our third site. I told you, I'm rushing right through these. I got a lot to cover. So this is Miss Steppy. Now this vessel, she is in only 3 to 4 feet of water, so she's also very, very shallow. She is right near shore, just south of City Pier in Port St. Joe. So if you've ever launched a boat right there, you go right past her every time. There's a nice slanted pole that's right where the wreck is. So local historian Herman Jones did some research on this vessel back in the early 2000s, and he submitted the Florida Master Site File form back in 2005. Now, the site has never been investigated by an archaeologist before, so a lot of this was just based on his research. And so what he found and what's included in the site file form is that this vessel was believed to have been built around 1905 in Apalachicola as a launch, and probably lost sometime around 1915. And according to what he found, she had a 2-cylinder engine and was about 35 feet long. So not a large vessel, just a dainty little thing. She was named after Miss Steppy Rice Porter of Apalachicola. She was from a well-to-do family, and she was also a school teacher at the Chapman School. Miss Steppy was owned by T.H. Stone, the same guy from Port St. Joe. He had operated a turpentine business back then, and that's around the time when the vessel was lost. So she is associated with him. Jones published some of his research in the local newspaper, The Star, down in Port St. Joe, but unfortunately his sources were not cited. So trying to go back and start where he finished up his research was a challenge. And he also passed away about a month after Hurricane Michael. So I have not been able to track down like his original notes and that. So I kind of had to go a different route. So I started looking at the annual list of merchant vessels of the United States, and Miss Steppy appears from 1907 all the way to 1919. She's registered every year. She was built in Apalachicola, but it was in 1907. And she was 43 feet in length, so just a little bit longer than what his research had found. She had a 50 horsepower engine and a crew of 4, and her home port was Apalachicola between all of those years. At least that's what was listed in the NDUS. In addition, I looked at the U.S. Steamboat Inspection Service records, and she shows up just between 1908 and 1911. And at that time, it indicated that she had a kerosene engine. And from 1908 to 1910, she had been inspected in Apalachicola, but after that, she had been inspected in Port St. Joe. So that's roughly the time frame that T.H. Stone must have acquired her, because then she kind of shifted over there. On the right, this is the only known photograph of Miss Steppy.
Sorry.
It's okay. This is what Herman Jones had in his collection. And unfortunately, the bow and the stern are cut off. So we're really just looking at the center part of it. But you can see the wheelhouse in the center and get kind of a rough idea of what a motor launch would have looked like in the early 1900s. So I also hit the newspaper archives pretty hard, and I was able to track a lot of her activities, where she was going port to port, what she was carrying, and just kind of learn more about her story, which was pretty cool. So here's what the wreck looks like now. All that's really left, and this is a side scan sonar mosaic showing her kerosene engine. And I don't know if you can use your mouse or not, but right here, these are her 2 cylinders, and this is the flywheel for the engine and the rest of the engine components. The bow goes to the southeast, the stern is towards the northwest, and the wooden hull right now is completely buried, but it appears to be mostly intact. So I luckily stumbled upon a published personal account of this man named Higgins Watts, who is T.H. Stone's grandson. Totally fortuitous. I was just in a coffee shop in Port St. Joe and like, oh, this looks cool. Well, it turns out he had a story in his account about Miss Steppy. And when he was a boy, around 10 years old, he was, doing what boys do, kind of wandering along the shoreline, kicking stuff around, and he found a wooden plank that had the letters Miss Step on it. And later on that evening, he went home and of course told his mom about it. She's like, oh, that was your granddaddy's vessel, Miss Steppy. And it turns out that he had abandoned the vessel where it is now sometime around 1938. And a hurricane rolled through in the early 1940s and just destroyed the wreck. And apparently the wheelhouse got washed about 7 miles away, all the way down to towards Cape San Blas. So now we have kind of a better idea of when Miss Steppy likely succumbed to Mother Nature. So one of the data sets that I used was looking at aerial imagery. Because this site is so shallow, I was able to pull aerial images from over the years and look at how the site has changed over time. So I'm just going to go through these kind of quickly. You can see these are in 3-year increments. So it's pretty much just the engine is exposed. That's really all you see. But after Michael, there was a whole lot more of wooden hull structure that was exposed. So you can see just the force of the storm surge coming into Port St. Joe. It really scoured out the hull on the opposite side of where the engine is. So that was definitely an impact right there. So now moving on to Dog Island, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this wreck because it generated so much social media attention after Michael. This is Dog Island wreck number 3, as in it's the 3rd wreck that's been found on Dog Island. This one is currently located onshore. It's on the western end, right between Shipping Cove and the Gulf. So it is well up on land now. It's no longer in the water. This wreck was originally discovered back in 2012, eroding out of the shoreline, and it was eventually, BAR was able to get out there a couple months later and go record the site, but you see in the photo in the middle, very little of it was still sticking up. So Lindsay Smith, formerly with BAR, she led this investigation. What she found was that it was definitely a wreck. It was oriented roughly east-west, but could not determine the bow from the stern just because there wasn't enough of it exposed. So she was able to see from the images that were shared with her that it was composite built. So it's a wooden hull with iron knees for deck supports. She also looked at some of the work that had been done previously, by Chuck Mead, who's a fellow FSU grad and longtime friend of mine. He did a lot of work back in 1999 looking at the 1899 wrecks. And he was able to positively identify the Norwegian bark Vala. And you can kind of see that on the lower left. Now, when Lindsay looked at this information that Chuck had compiled, there was an indication for an unknown wreck number 1, which is kind of off to the left, and you can see it in blue on the screen. So this next image, this is another photo that was taken after the hurricane. We're going to kind of zoom into this left-hand side of the screen to get a better view. So just to the center left, that is the Norwegian bark Vala. And that was wrecked with the bow pointing directly south towards the Gulf. And to its right is the Norwegian bark, pardon my bad Norwegian pronunciation, Jafna. I do not speak Norwegian, so I'm trying. And off to the left of this vessel, to the far left, you can see unknown wreck number 1. So here's another view of that looking back towards the wrecks, and you can see the Norwegian barks there to the far left and then kind of in the center. All of the American vessels that are indicated here, they were all refloated. They were all salvaged. All the American vessels went away, and it was just the foreign vessels that were left behind. But you can see this vessel in the very foreground. This is unknown wreck number 1, based on the caption that was on these photographs. So based on Mead's studies that he had done back in '99, she was able to eliminate all the vessels that were refloated. Vala, which he had successfully identified, all the ones that wrecked on St. George, because obviously that's a different place. Wrecks that occurred in other areas and had either been salvaged or were definitely not in the same area. And then eventually she honed in on unknown wreck number 1, possibly being the remains of an unnamed schooner. And this is based on identification from a survivor who returned to Dog Island in the early 1960s, and he identified his vessel as Vala. He was a sailor on board and came back when he was in his 80s. And according to his memory, he recalled that there was another schooner that was probably lost out there and another bark that he wasn't sure of the name of. So based on that, Smith thought that this Dog Island Wreck 3 might be the unnamed schooner. So she looked at those images again and was able to kind of get a rough idea of how all the different vessels were in relation to one another, and then superimpose them on top of an aerial photo of Dog Island. And so all the vessels that are outlined in red, those are all the American vessels. They were refloated, they're gone. So she honed in on this unknown wreck and thought, well, maybe that's Dog Island wreck number 3. Maybe that's what it is, this unknown schooner. So fast forward a few years later, so the wreck ended up getting recovered, and then it got uncovered again in 2017. So BAR, again, returned to take a look at this wreck, this time led by Ivor Malama, who led a team out there. And of course, by the time they got out there, you could see the image on the right. Much of the wreck had become buried once again. So what he was able to determine is that, based on the measurements of the frames that were sticking out, this was probably a 400 to 500 ton vessel. So he suggested that it might be that other Norwegian bark, Jafna, not a schooner. It's too big to be a schooner. Schooners are much smaller. So he felt it's this one. It's Jafna. So then Hurricane Michael comes along and does his or her thing. So the yellow circle, that's where Dog Island Rec 3 was in 2012 and 2017. Hurricane Michael came along. Now, Hurricane Michael, Iowa, is over 60 miles away to the northwest. All of the surge that it brought in hammered Dog Island shoreline. It absolutely hammered it. And it basically dug the wreck out and deposited a quarter of a mile down the beach. So that's where the green circle is. That's where it
Oh,
landed.
sorry.
That's where it landed after Hurricane Michael. The red circle is where just the annual winter storms eventually just pushed it further up on the beach where it is today. So quite a lot of activity going on this poor wreck. So this is what it looked like right after Michael. And I have to thank Dan Osley, who sent me all these amazing drone footage of this wreck. But here you can see this is like fresh after Michael and just how much of the lower hull is preserved. Unfortunately, you can see one end of it has been completely demolished. So BAR returned again in 2019 to go take a look at this wreck. And once again, Ivor Mollema reaffirmed, okay, this has to be a 400 to 500 ton vessel. And he still suggested that Yachtnar was likely the candidate for this wreck. So when I came along in December of 2022, my first time visiting the wreck, it had already started accumulating a lot of sand, which is really, really good because it helps cover up the wood, but it does make it hard to measure. And I was not there to excavate. So I was focusing on what I could actually see. So I collected measurements in both imperial system and in metric system because we're still kind of hazy on the nationality. So I mean, it could be American or English using the imperial system, or it could be metric, which is like everybody else. So some of the other things that I documented was looking at the state of preservation, and the photos that you saw a few minutes ago where it actually had copper sheathing, that's gone. It is wandered away off to people's homes all over the place. And so here's what's left of the outer hull plank. But I also looked at some of the construction elements that were exposed to try and get an idea of how the vessel was constructed. And this in particular is one feature I was looking at. This is called a scarf. So anybody who does woodwork, when you're joining two timbers together, you want that longitudinal strength, and you don't just join them butt to butt. You taper off either end and slap them together and then put through bolts through them. So this is a particular type of scarf that's called a lock scarf or a keyed scarf. So there's a little bit of a groove that's carved into the center of both of those timbers, and you wedge a piece of wood in there, and that helps lock everything in place. So this is a very specific type of scarfing method that was used in this ship construction, and that will come back in a minute. How to use. So I also had the opportunity to collect wood samples from this wreck. Yes, which was a lot of fun. I do not recommend trying to saw through massive wooden timbers because the wood is absolutely solid. And my little hand saws, unintended, just wasn't cutting it. So I was able to sample hull planking, ceiling planking, whales, and then just a part of one frame, which I think I lost like 5 years of my life trying to hack through that. And thank you to Morgan Smith, who joined me on that lovely, lovely day. But the wood inside is in spectacular condition. It's the outside that's really getting weathered. Now, this doesn't mean people need to go collecting wood samples from this wreck. Please, plenty of people already have. But the wood is in great shape. And it was identified as a type of harder yellow pine. All of the samples I collected, again, the smaller timbers were harder yellow pine. And so these are the different species that are included. So I also wanted to go back and take a look at the 1899 hurricane photos and just kind of take a look at them and reassess them. And I did find some that were slightly different than what Mead and Smith had looked at, because they were looking at black and white versions. And I found some additional duplicates of a few of those that were this sort of like sepia color, which was really interesting. And they had slightly different captions too. So the black and white version of this photo identified this wreck in the foreground as unknown, but the caption I saw noted it as Ranavola, which is a third Norwegian bark. Now, a lot of the earlier research that's been done, Ranavola was kind of on the outskirts, like it wrecked somewhere in the surrounding water, so not a lot of attention was focused on it. So that really piqued my curiosity and intrigued me. So that brought me down the rabbit hole of doing a lot more archival investigation. And I was able, I tracked down this photo. This is from a different angle looking southwestward toward the Gulf. And there's Ranavola all the way over on the left. So it's just past where Vala and Jaffna are located. So I also was able to confirm that Ranavola did indeed wreck in Dog Island. It was one of those wrecks because an agent from Lloyd's of London had come over and cabled back to London that the Norwegian barks Ranavola, Vala, and Jaffna are ashore high and dry. They have been condemned and will be sold. And it's also indicated in Lloyd's casualty returns for the summer of 1899, where it's listed as having been lost on Dog Island. So we know Ranavola was a third Norwegian bark that was there at the time. So Smith's unknown schooner appears to be Ranavola, which was an English-built vessel. In 1869, she was constructed in Newcastle upon Tyne, which is in northern England. She was later sold to Norway in 1891, hence the Norwegian flag, but she was actually English built. So while that was intriguing, and it was interesting because some of my measurements actually aligned more with the imperial system than the metric system, which was like, that's really interesting for Dog Island Wreck 3. But when you go back and look at the orientation and the spatial distribution of these wrecks, and when you plot the coordinates for where Vala was positively identified and where the east and west ends of Dog Island Wreck 3 are, they're right off of Vala's bow. They're right there. So, I mean, that would indicate that it is indeed Jaffna. However, prior to Hurricane Michael, and Jan also was kind enough to share these photos with me just a few days ago. So this is what she looked like prior to Hurricane Michael coming through. And you can see one end of the wreck is well preserved. The other end is like completely demolished. It's hard to tell where it ends. So you can't really get a solid length measurement on this wreck. It's in excess of 100 feet. That's how much I can tell you based on this image. So we have two Norwegian barks in Dog Island that are both more than 100 feet long. Yes, I know. One was constructed in Norway, Jaffna, and then the other Ranavola was constructed in England. So my hypothesis is that eventually, assuming this is indeed Jaffna or Wreck 3, that Ranavola is eventually going to start emerging from the beach because she is right in that same area. And fortunately, with my rabbit hole digging, I was actually able to find the original survey report for when she was constructed in 1861. It has all of her measurements. It has the types of wood that was used throughout her hull. So if she does arise from the beach at some point, I have that information that could be used for a comparative data set to help identify. So that was a very cool discovery.
But that means Dog Island has to have another hurricane.
Dog Island's continuing to move forward. Yeah. So this is what Dog Island Wreck 3 has looked since 2022, and that yellow arrow is pointing at a segment of her rider keelson. And then it's no longer there in October 24 after Hurricane Helene had rolled through the area. So where did she go? Where did that section of massive timber go? Well, Mr. Harlan Sparrow was kind enough to get in touch with me and say, hey, I found this timber over in Ballast Cove. You want to come take a look at it? So went and took a look at it. It is indeed from Dog Island Wreck 3. And it was dragged, pushed, carried, floated almost 1.5 miles eastward. So unfortunately, this wreck, despite it being up on the beach, is still going to get hammered by storms because that stretch of Dog Island, there's not a lot of elevation there. So just to kind of give you a little primer on why I'm talking about a rider keelson. So when you're talking about, this is a very basic ship construction. So you start with the keel, that's the very bottom. Then you have your floors and your futtocks. Those comprise the frames, and that's what gives the hull its shape. You slap on top of that what's called the keelson, and you can add multiple keelsons on top to make it much more strong in the longitudinal sense. You can also add some on the sides of the main keelson. So we have here, this is the floor timber on the bottom, right above that. And this is really odd, but her main keelson, it isn't one solid timber. It's actually 4 smaller timbers that are all conjoined together And on top of that is a rider keelson. And then beside the main keelson, there's a sister keelson on either side. So that's what's left. So this is the part, this is where it came from. So that timber that you found, this is where it came from. So at the very top, you can see what's left of the rider keelson, that segment that was adjoining it. Below it is the main keelson, and you can see right here, you can see two separate pieces. Well, there are two more under that. And one of those pieces, this part that's kind of missing where the sand is, that was still attached to that piece of rider keelson. So it's gone on its own little vacation, but what is left, unfortunately, is down to about 60 feet. So less than half of the vessel's full length remains. So that puts it in a pretty precarious position. So now we're going to move to a different Dog Island wreck. This is Dog Island wreck number 1. And this wreck is currently in about 10 feet of water. It's offshore of Shipping Cove in the Gulf side. And it's been investigated several times, starting back in 1987 when it was up on the beach. It was investigated by archaeologists. Then again in 1995, Nancy White came up here with a crew. And then again in 1999 through Chuck Mead and FSU's work. So it's been investigated several times. The wreck itself measures about 75 feet in length with a 20-foot beam. And it was believed to be schooner rigged. It was also interpreted as the fishing smack Priscilla, which wrecked on September 1914 on Carabel Bar. So that was interpreted as Dog Island. And even though Priscilla measured 69.3 feet in length, so a little smaller, that was sort of the interpretation, like, oh, this must be the fishing smack Priscilla. And that story is kind of stuck. But is it the fishing smack Priscilla? No, it is not. And here's why. So I scoured through any historical map I could find, nautical charts and whatever, trying to find Carabel Bar. Where is Carabel Bar? And I finally found it is right off the mouth of the Carabel River. And I found it in this U.S. Lighthouse Establishment report from 1908, of all things. And then again, through a U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey report. So this is the predecessor to NOAA. In 1913, they had installed 2 navigation lights, one in the front and one in the rear of the Carabel River Bar. So this is where Carabel Bar is. Now, as far as the wreck is concerned, so Priscilla did wreck in 1914 on Carabel Bar, but as it was going into the mouth of the river, it broke in 2. So it is definitely not the same wreck as what's off Dog Island, because that one is completely intact. So here's kind of a cool little overlay of aerial imagery showing this wreck and how much Dog Island is like moving away. And it's 2 main processes that are happening. You have the sort of the systemic change, which is happening from longshore currents, just coming along, peeling the sand off and redepositing it on either end of Dog Island. But then you have these episodic events like hurricanes and major storms, and they come through and they basically bulldoze the beach up over the top and down the other side. So we have it kind of peeling away on the front and then pushed back. And so these things are constantly happening. So Dog Island is continuing to move northward. So here, with the red arrow, this is wreck number 1 in 1999. And then in 2004, so watch the shoreline. Don't pay attention to the wreck because it's not going to move. Watch the shoreline. It just keeps moving further and further away. And the wreck is getting in deeper and deeper water. And sometimes you can see it in aerial imagery, and sometimes you can't. And there it goes in 2020. And here's where it is now in 2024. It's almost 400 feet from the shoreline. So that's quite a lot of movement in just 20 some odd years. That's a lot. So unfortunately, with that movement and the wreck having been buried for quite a bit of its time, it's now exposed. So what you can kind of see on the left hand, that's a side scan sonar image of what's left of the wreck, and it's basically just the stern section. So a lot of the previous investigations had focused on the bow because the stern was buried. But now that's no longer the case. The stern has now been exposed and the bow has basically been wiped away. So if there are still timbers there, they're going to be buried below the seafloor, but otherwise this is what's left. At the very bottom of this image, you can kind of see there's a little bit of the rudder that's still there. And unfortunately, the wreck is not in good condition. But if you look at where the yellow circle is, this area, I returned after Hurricane Helene this past February, and checked out the wreck again, and some of that had kind of eroded away even more. So this particular wreck is still just, it's going to be exposed to a lot of these winter storms, hurricanes, and the process is just going to continue. On the right, I kind of went through the aerial imagery and just measured how much of the wreck was visible above the seafloor, and you can kind of see how it's been changing over time. And unfortunately, there's only just over about 40 feet of it left. So about half of it is, almost half of it is gone. So now we are going to move to the Dog Island Lighthouse. And just to give you some perspective on the wrecks that we've already talked about. So here's the lighthouse on the red dot. That's Dog Island wreck number 1 that we just talked about. There's Dog Island wreck number 2, that's Vala. And then Dog Island wreck number 3, that's the one that's up on the beach. And so now we're moving over towards the lighthouse. So the Dog Island Lighthouse was originally constructed in 1838, and you can see the survey map of where it was located when it was first constructed. It was built by Winslow Lewis, who basically had a monopoly on constructing lighthouses along the Panhandle, so a lot of the other lighthouses in the area were also constructed by him. Unfortunately, in 1842, a gale came along and damaged the tower. They rebuilt it. Then another storm came along and damaged it again. They rebuilt it, rinse, wash, repeat. Eventually, in the Great Middle Florida Hurricane of 1851, it annihilated the lighthouse, and it was rebuilt again as a brick tower with a 4th order Fresnel lens installed. After an 1852 gale, again, rebuilt in 1855, and this time it actually survived the 1856 storm that wrecked SS Florida over in St. Joe Bay. So it actually did well. So here are some elevation plans that I tracked down of the lighthouse tower on the left and the lighthouse keeper's house on the right. And you can see that the lighthouse keeper's house was a square structure that was elevated up on stilts. And on the left is the earliest known photo that we have of the tower and the lighthouse keeper's house. And on the right, you can see an 1859 map of where the lighthouse was, and it was well up on the beach. So during the American Civil War, it initially served as a lookout for the Confederacy during the Union blockade, and eventually the Confederates abandoned it. The Union sailors moved in, and apparently they used it as a smoking lounge and perhaps socialized with the fine ladies of Apalachicola and basically treated it like a fraternity house until they left it. It was repaired and put back into service after the war ended. And around this time in the late 1860s, that's when erosion really started to be noticed and like, hey, you know, we need to think about this. Unfortunately, they didn't, and an 1872 storm came along and it started the tower leaning about a foot out of perpendicular. At that point, they removed the lamp and lens, put them on the lighthouse keeper's house, but then in 1873, a hurricane came along and that was it. The whole thing was washed out into the sea. And so we have a pretty good proxy of that from the Cape St. George Lighthouse, which is actually a sister lighthouse, very similar to Dog Island. And so I'm sure some of you might remember that in 1999, it started to lean, and then several years later, it finally toppled into the sea. It was removed and reconstructed on St. George Island. So if you go to St. George Island, this is the lighthouse. And if you want to get a feel for what the Dog Island Lighthouse Tower was like, go check that one out, because they're the same guy constructing them. So now it's way offshore. It's no longer on land. So this is where land was back in 1870s when the lighthouse was on land. Sometimes you can see it in aerial imagery, sometimes you can't, unfortunately. There have been several previous archaeological investigations. Chuck Mead was out there in '99 and did a side scan survey. FSU returned in 2006. BAR has been out there more recently after Michael, and just kind of getting an idea of what the site looks like. So we have the tower rubble has been mapped. That's to the south. Up towards the north there, to the upper part of the screen, that's the remains of the lighthouse keeper's house, including one of the stilts that the house was on. So a lot of that stuff is still there. When I went out in 2024, I went to do a side scan sonar survey and noticed that, you know, even several years after Michael, a lot more of the rubble from the tower had been exposed. It's sitting up on the seafloor where it had previously been buried. After Helene rolled through, I was able to go back out and resurvey that same area and found that even more rubble had been exposed, and more of the lighthouse keeper's house up towards the top of the screen. So now we're going to move to the northeast a little bit over to Lanark Reef. And this wreck has been known in the oral history as a LCM, or landing craft mechanized. It's currently in about 9 to 11 feet of water, depending on the tide, and it's just south of the central part of Lanark Reef. So if you're ever out there in a boat, the A-frame used to stick up above the water. It no longer does. It's long gone. But it was believed to be an LCM because several had known to have sunk and foundered in the area in the 1940s during Camp Gordon Johnston's activities. So we know from newspaper accounts that yes, indeed, some of these landing craft did sink. What I have not been able to track down yet is any sort of salvage records from the military. Did they go ahead and pull them back up? But anyway, that's how this particular wreck got the story and the sort of identification as an LCM. So FSU went out in 99 and took just a very cursory look at it and thought, yeah, maybe it's an LCM. But later on in the early 2000s, there were several more excursions that went out, and the measurements just didn't quite match up with any of the types of LCMs that were known. So Matt Keith, who is a longtime friend of mine, a fellow FSU grad, he took this project on as his master's thesis and went back out to continue recording it. And this is a site plan that he came up with back in the early 2000s. So it's too short to be an LCM. And it's right at the right beam. It's 14 feet, but the cargo opening, as you could see before, like it's in an LCM is wide open, so you can fit vehicles and troops and all kinds of stuff. This is clearly not that. So Matt was the first to suggest that it might be a World War II era dredge. So I think he's right. Unfortunately, I have yet to find a solid lead on a dredge that was lost in this area. So I'm still trying to track it down. But this wreck, since the early 2000s work in Matt's archaeological site plan, the wreck has actually deteriorated quite a bit. There are a lot more holes in the deck. The metal is it's deteriorating and eroding away. So the A-frame is long gone. Some of the features that were around it have also disappeared. But after Hurricane Helene, it didn't appear to have changed very much. So I think it managed to survive, being in St. George Sound, a little bit calmer waters than some of the wrecks that were offshore. And last but not least, so this one has sentimental value for me. This is the very first wreck that I led a project on. So this is like just a few years ago. So the oral history of this wreck, so it's in about 9 to 11 feet of water. Again, depending on tide, it's right off the mouth of the river. It's northwest of where the St. Mark's Lighthouse is, and it's right near channel marker number 12. So if you're ever heading out that way and you go past channel marker 12, it's right there. So the oral history about this particular wreck and what I was told back in just a few years ago, I interviewed a man named Alton Gresham, and his father, John Gresham, was the St. Mark's Lighthouse keeper at the time that this wrecking event occurred. And so according to what Mr. Gresham could recall, the wreck was believed to be a former private yacht that was donated to the Navy for conversion to a World War I sub-chaser. So if you've ever been to the lighthouse, you've probably seen the materials that reference that wreck as a former sub-chaser. So, and apparently after the war, it was reconverted back to a pleasure yacht named Dispatch and then sold to the state of Florida Shellfish Commission in the early 1920s. In 1928, a generator caught fire. The lighthouse keeper saw it, towed the wreck out of the channel, and that's where it ran aground and lays today. It was also heavily salvaged for metal after the wrecking event, especially during World War II. So that was the oral history. So here's what it looked like in 1998, just a few years ago, when I went out there as a grad student to do the first archaeological investigation, and quite a bit of it was sticking up above the water. I mean, you could clearly see it at low tide. You can't miss it. Now, it's sometimes marked by a buoy and sometimes marked by a bird. That's all that's sticking up above the water. So it is definitely a navigation hazard. So be very careful when you're going by channel marker number 12. Don't sway outside of the channel because you'll hit the wreck. So is it a former sub-chaser? No. And here's why. Thank you for newspaper archives, because I was able to track not one vessel, but two. So there was a sub-chaser owned by the Shellfish Commission, and there was a former private yacht owned by the Shellfish Commission, but they're two completely separate vessels. They're not the same vessel. So the Florida Shellfish Commission, which today is the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, you know those folks? So the Shellfish Commission, they had sort of a dual mandate for both conservation and law enforcement for oyster reef leases. And then they took on the seafood role in making sure that, you know, everything was done legally. So they patrolled along the waters all around Florida, and they used the subchaser, which they got from Congress in 1923, and used it as a patrol vessel. And then they later on acquired the private yacht. And so both of these vessels appear simultaneously in the annual merchant vessel list of the United States, both under vessels of the United States Navy. So one, the Dispatch, is 146 feet long. So that's about how long the St. Mark's Lighthouse wreck is. The Subchaser was wooden hulled and it was only 105 feet long. So they're definitely not the same vessel. And so I wanted to track the history of what happened to the Subchaser. And eventually it was put up for sale and sold to C.D. Oots of Wakulla. You know the Oots family? That's them. So he took this vessel, he took the former Subchaser and salvaged what he could to build his fishing fleet, and then discarded the remains somewhere in the St. Mark's River near Newport. And so if anybody wants to go kayaking with me sometime, I would love to go find this wreck. So the other vessel, the one that's off the lighthouse now, this is the former vessel named Vixen when it was originally constructed in 1913, and it was constructed for John Dustin Archbold, who is the president of the Standard Oil Company. So a well-to-do kind of guy. She was built as a steel-hulled vessel with two 750 horsepower vertical triple expansion steam engines, two Seabury water tube boilers. And after he passed away, the family sold her to the United States Navy in 1917, where she was commissioned as USS Vixen, and then her name was changed to Dispatch with an E, not an I. She served as a patrol yacht along the eastern seaboard. She was also a tender for the Atlantic Fleet, and then she had the terrible, rough duty of serving as the flagship for admirals, vice admirals, and rear admirals. Oof, fancy, fancy. She was decommissioned, though, in 1921 and basically mothballed by the Navy until an act of Congress gave her to the state of Florida in 1928. Just take her, we're done with her. So the Florida Shellfish Commission ended up using her for patrolling, but then here's the cool thing. They converted her into a floating fish hatchery, the first of its kind. And so her function was to travel all around the state of Florida, depositing different hatchlings, whether it was crab, lobster, mullet, you name it. So she was instrumental in helping to build Florida's seafood industry by bringing all of these different hatchlings to different areas. So you can claim her for that. Unfortunately, that all came to a screeching halt May 22nd of 1929 when she did catch on fire, and that's what she looked like. And so the lighthouse keeper was just doing his thing, and he did what anyone would do these days. He snapped a photo, posted it to his Insta, and texted a friend. Look what's going on. So on the right, that is his lighthouse keeper's logbook, and it shows SFC number 10, Shellfish Commission vessel number 10, the Dispatch, burned, started at 8:50 a.m. So we know exactly when the wrecking event happened. And so there she is today, where the red arrow is pointing to. She's just kind of off to the side, sometimes marked, sometimes not. As far as remote sensing data was concerned, she actually seemed to have handled the storms pretty well. I mean, she is almost 150 feet long, steel hulled. So she's in pretty good condition. The bow and the stern, they were damaged many, many, many years ago. So this is not storm related. The image on the right, so this is multi-beam echo sounder. So this is another type of sonar that's used. And you can see the river channel is there in blue. That's the area. So she's right up on a shoal just outside of the river channel. And there she is after Helene. Really not a lot of changes there, fortunately. So where is all this going? So what were the impacts? Very briefly, so Weimar, more of that wreck was exposed by Michael, which is not good for shipwrecks. Metal and salt water do not mix well. So unfortunately, what might happen with that newly exposed metal is it could actually lead to enhanced deterioration over time. There's not a heck of a lot you can do with it. It's a big ship and no one's going out there and dumping sandbags on it. It's just not feasible. With SS Florida, fortunately, the sediment covers the entire wooden hull, so none of the wood is exposed. So that's good for long-term preservation. Unfortunately, with the firebox still kind of sticking up out of the water, that's going to continue to deteriorate over time. There's really not much that can be done about that. With Miss Steppy, the big danger there is more storms coming through and scouring right back out that wooden hull and exposing it again. Any of that wood getting exposed, it's going to start to degrade. With Dog Island Rec 3, unfortunately, I would argue that the greatest impact has been humans. There have been a lot of pieces of wood that have been cut off, not the ones that I sampled, but others who had sampled before me, and likely not for scientific purposes. But the copper sheathing is gone. That's going to allow the newly exposed wood to get a lot more weathering. But fortunately, the wind is starting to build up sands on it. It's sort of catching those sands. That's a really good thing. So the more it gets buried, the longer it'll last. With Dog Island Rec 1, unfortunately, because so much of it's already been destroyed, the island is moving away, pulling its sediments with it. It's going to get lifted up and deposited somewhere. It's inevitable. So much of it has been scoured underneath the hull. It's only a matter of time, and it's probably going to end up not too far from Dog Island Rec 3. With the lighthouse, fortunately, it's made of brick. Brick handles the marine environment like nobody's business, so the site is pretty stable. I don't anticipate any real issues with that. With the Lanark Reef Wreck, because so much of that metal has been deteriorating, because it's in shallow water, it's going to be exposed to tidal fluctuations and storm surge. I think it's just going to continue to deteriorate. There's really not a heck of a lot we can do about that, but just monitor it over time. With the St. Mark's Lighthouse Wreck, it's relatively stable. The big issue there are boat collisions, which I have found in different chat rooms online where people have said, yeah, I crashed into it and my wife went flying. So I know it's been happening. And unfortunately, if it's not marked, it's going to happen again because it's not sticking up above the water anymore. And it's a big hunk of metal down there. So you don't want to crash your boat into her.
Is that number 12?
What's that?
Was that what the buoy number 12?
Yeah, channel marker number 12.
Okay, so it is marked.
Yes,
Not-
yeah, it's
not a big
not
deal.
right next to the channel marker.
Correct.
So if you were to go outside of the channel, you could hit it. So very briefly, just some sort of broad cultural resource management and other recommendations for the state to consider. With Weimar, the Mexico Beach Artificial Reef Association, they're out there on Weimar all the time. It is one of their artificial reef sites, and they have a ton of them that they deposited in the area. So they have a lot of photos of Weimar prior to Michael and after. And so they could be a really good source of providing sort of time series images before and after storms to help the state with, okay, well now what does Weimar look like? But also dive shops, because it's an underwater archaeological preserve, dive shops could provide a lot of photos of this wreck moving forward. For Dog Island Wrecks number 1 and 3, I strongly urge the state to consider both of those wrecks as candidates for the Shipwreck Tagging Archaeological Management Program. And for those of you who are not familiar, this was developed by Austin Burkhart when he was a student at University of West Florida. He worked with the Florida Public Archaeology Network to get this program going. It has since been adopted by the National Park Service, I think in like half a dozen of their parks for their underwater sites. And also the state of Maryland has adopted this program. And what that entails is permanently affixing these tags, these weatherproof tags, to some of the shipwreck timbers. And what they have on them is QR codes. And so if someone stumbles along this timber on a beach and it's got a tag on it, they can simply snap the QR code, fill out a bunch of information, and immediately goes to the state and say, oh, now we know timber number blah, blah, blah is over here when it used to be over here. So that's important information for state managers who are trying to keep track of these resources. And kind of thinking outside the box, we have the Florida Shipwreck Trail where divers can go check out some of these wrecks, but I would love to talk with the state and the FPAN folks about developing a maritime heritage snorkeling trail to make some of these shallow water sites that are accessible either from shore or from small boats, and develop some outreach materials based on their story that dive charter boat captains and dive shop owners can take and share with these folks that are going out there and kind of give some of their stories. You know, Florida, SS Florida, for example, I found a letter written by a lady who survived. She wrote a letter to her sister and it was published in the newspaper. And it gives literally an hour-by-hour account of what she was experiencing. And her 2 kids were there with her. She could only hold one. And she was trusting an entire stranger to hold her other child and keep them safe. And you can hear the emotion as you're reading through it. So something like that, being able to immerse yourself in the experience of what happened with some of these wrecks. I mean, I think who wouldn't pay for that? So I think this is something that could be looked at in terms of economic development for these areas. So last but not least, I can't end without thanking all of these folks who have really helped out, especially Morgan Smith. He really stepped up and helped me with the field work. I was only able to get to some of the sites by myself and record them, but others I needed a team. And so he really stepped up. He threw some of his students at me who are not shipwreck students, but they were so great and came out anyway to map all of this lovely Holocene trash, as our friend Grail would say. Definitely the boat folks who provided boats, Hunter Whitehead, who's helped with the 3D modeling, Captain Mike Ball. Of course, Mr. Harlan Sparrow, he is the one who notified me about, and Robin, who notified me about that timber ending up in Ballast Cove. And then, of course, Dan Osley, who provided all of the amazing photos of Dog Island Wreck 3 and allowed me to trespass on its property to record it. So I definitely want to thank him too. And with that, if we even have any time, I'm happy to take questions. If you're still with me.
Yeah.
I wanted to find out if you would compile these slides any place that we can access them later so that we could read them again.
Oh, okay. So you're.
I am recording this right now and it will be on the past YouTube channel.
Okay.
Give me, it might take a little bit of time because we're going out of town soon, but yeah,
Well, like days or what?
might be a couple of weeks.
Okay.
I do have a full-time job. But I promise I will get it up there. In due course. Thank you, Jeanette.
But I'm mainly a terrestrial archaeologist, but when I see these things that are being moved so far by some of the storms, at what point do you think that it makes, well, at what point do they, you don't really write them off, but at what point would it be a better idea if you can, if you're able to actually remove the things, the pieces that have been blown away from the original spot, and maybe try to either preserve those or in the worst case scenario, just salvage what you can from it for exhibits or study it.
Yeah, so I completely understand that the big difference between terrestrial and underwater archaeology is with anything you pull out of the water, especially in the marine environment with all the salts, you have to conserve it, and that can be a years-long process and also a very expensive process to preserve all of that. But then you have to store it. You need a permanent curation
I know
plan.
that's true. I've got to do this, trust me.
Right. But these are much bigger.
But the thing is, what I'm saying is that in some of those cases, like if you just get a portion of it that's blown a mile north or whatever, it's no longer in context, of course. If the things that were originally in it are no longer associated with it, you know what wreck it is, you know what time, all that kind of stuff. In some cases, wouldn't it be better just to go ahead and take all that stuff out and physically have some, well, you know, Lee Newsom or somebody could study the wood and you could maybe remove all the metal pieces out and some of them that are worth long-term electrolysis, you know, do that. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we necessarily do that, but I'm just seeing that these things, when they get moved out of their original context, sometimes repeatedly and very quickly, you know, I just don't.
That's the whole tragedy for me as a collections manager watching this and all of the research, the incredible research that you put into this. It's just tragic, but there's no possible way that we can, even like a dozen of these things, we just simply can't handle them. Like right now, the big tanks are full of canoes, and we have found out because of construction at the Gray Building, the lab's going to be closed for a year. So we have to get those out of the big tanks into temporary tanks, and you know. It's just,
We're in Grassfield, like they just moved all of Purdy's reserve canoes out of the med center basement.
it's
Put them in
just,
semis and moved them elsewhere, and it was.
it's just too much, it's too big and it's too expensive. So thank God for people like Melanie that have been given grants like this to study this stuff and do all this incredible archival research.
Well, but I think the other missing piece that I think needs to be acknowledged is folks like Harlan Sparrow who notify and say, hey, I found a timber. You want to come take a look at it? And if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have known about it and known that it was indeed from Dog Island Rec 3. Go ahead.
I'd like to acknowledge Bill Stowe, who's the Dog Island Board Chair, but who's actually pointing me in your direction. He said, these are the people you need to contact, so thanks to him for that, and we were able to convey to you the information.
Right, but that's the key right there is the citizen science component. Is the folks who are out there who live in the areas who can say, hey, it used to be here and now it's over here. You know, I mean, the state can't be everywhere at once. I know that.
Yeah.
A lot of this, you know, things like aerial imagery over time can help with those management aspects. I mean, you know, Dog Island Rec 3, it's right there. So the next aerial image that goes over, boom, you have new data.
In line with what Jeff's saying, the one that you saw the piece off of, and it was so well preserved, it's a shame that you can't at least have a cross cut of that somewhere, because you could see the rings and everything is so well preserved.
So all of those samples are going back to the state. So yeah, they don't come home with me. Now that the.
No, I know that, but
That's my
but
job.
I'm just saying, it's a shame that it's not, even education wise, how well that particular.
Right.
How those boats
Right.
were constructed and all that.
Yeah, well, and interestingly enough, I didn't include this, I didn't really dive off into that, but there are actually 4 of the timbers from Dog Island Rec 3 that mysteriously donated themselves to the Carabel History Museum late one night in 2022.
Yep. Yeah, we've seen those actually.
Guilty conscience.
Yeah.
Isn't the simplest solution to the problem video recording?
Well, I mean, it takes someone going out there.
Yeah.
And,
But that's a lot less expensive,
right,
and a lot more permanent.
right. Yeah, I mean, definitely with Rec 3 is by far the easiest to get to because it's up
You
on.
seem to have taken good documentation and been able to pull out a lot of
Mhm.
documentation.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Hey, Robin?
I would say that living on Long Island after Hurricane Michael, we had pictures of the ribs that were up before. And then, we flew over after the hurricane, and then there were 2 wrecks. Where as before, they were just the ribs. And then eventually, we all went down. There are many, many pictures. There is pottery, there is all kinds of things that came out of those wrecks. I'd be happy to send you, if you want them. There's a lot of wreck photos that came out of that, right after Michael, once we all kind of settled back.
Yeah.
And before the folks came down and started scavenging.
Yeah.
Because they came from all over, to the point where some of the folks that were near them, they had to put crime tape around their houses because people were climbing up on their stairs, they were cutting
it's a big
pieces
problem.
of the boat out. It was amazingly sad.
Yes.
Much good stuff, so.
Right.
But we did take a lot of photos before all of that happened, so.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, if you want to share
I'll
them.
be happy.
Yeah, I got a bunch from Dan
I'm
Austin.
sure you did. That's why I was.
I mean,
asking.
any.
Inundate you with them.
Yeah.
I have one other question, that's about ownership. For years I was working in Arkansas and I got so brainwashed with their laws, I don't really know down here, but when there's a shipwreck that is out in the water all the time. Who is that owned by the state as long as it's within the, okay?
Well, it gets a little gray area when you're talking about federal waters.
What happens when you have one of these that's up on the beach though, and somebody owns that property?
So, yes, so.
That's
I-
quite the
I
conundrum.
reached out to the homeowner to access Dog Island Rec 3 because it is.
The
on-
homeowner owns the site.
And Ryan Duggins would disagree that belongs to the homeowner.
Again, a follow-up question is, when one of these things starts out somewhere that's, let's say it's in state waters, and then a hurricane blows it a mile up on the shore, what do you do then?
Yeah,
Is
it's-
who-
It's something that has been discussed at length, I can tell you that, and I don't know that any definitive answers have been made.
Yeah.
It's just, there's, again, there's only so much that we can do. There's only so much that we can take into the conservation lab and to permanently curate. We are building a new building, but it's still not gonna be big enough.
It'd be full by the time it's finished.
Did anybody online have any questions? I'm only
He
seeing,
was there and he lived it, so he should.
I'm only,
If you
honestly-
look below the high water mark, why is it covered under 267?
What's that?
Why is not,
Which
considered
one?
a sovereignty submerged land?
Which side are you talking about?
Well, the ones that along the beach, for example, that were being cannibalized. Why are they not, what's the, I mean, I don't know the legal.
They were about 15 high water.
They were fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, for a while.
Yeah, right,
It's fair to me.
so
And
it's an evolving problem.
Who was actually gonna go out and
Yeah, who would enforce
monitor the
that?
situation? No one.
Right, no one,
Yeah.
exactly.
okay, he was having audio problems, but it was corrected. Nancy White says, thank you, great stuff. And Terry Cleland says, fascinating presentation, thank you. And with that, we're going to end the recording.